welcome to our Friday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. Today is the end of my third week of teaching on Joseph out of the book of Genesis. And I tell you, God has used the life of Joseph and the miracles that He did through Joseph to be a real inspiration to me. And I've just been trying to take the truths that I've learned, that I've applied to my life, and share them with you. And I tell you, if this does half as much for you as it's done for me, this could be a life-transforming revelation for you. It's amazing to me how most people do not turn to the Word of God and learn through the things that God's recorded in the Word. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 6 and 11 says that these things were written for our admonition so that we can learn through them, not to lust, not to murmur, not to complain, so that we can benefit from this. And yet the average Christian, they just don't go to the Word of God. It's like they have to learn all of these things through their own hard knocks instead of taking lessons from these people. But boy, I have learned volumes through Joseph, and I pray that this has been a blessing to you. Again, let me just emphasize this series, because even if you've watched every single program, it's different when you can sit down and just immerse yourself in this. You know, to get it in 30-minute segments and stuff, it's not the same as to get the thing and just immerse yourself and sit there for, this is about 6 hours worth of teaching. You could sit there for whatever period you could dedicate to that and just immerse yourself into it and go back over it over and over, time and again. That's the way that I am. I have studied these things hundreds of times, and I'm still gleaning things out of it. So I believe it's really important that you get the product. It would make these truths come alive in you. We've already covered a lot of things. I'm going to pick up in Genesis chapter 42, and this is after Joseph had come out of the pit into the palace. He is now the ruler over Egypt, and for 9 years, when he had absolute control and power, and he could have brought God's vision for his life to pass through his own strength and power, he didn't do it. He kept dependent upon God. He was totally waiting on God and God's timing. And for those 9 years, he just did what God had given him to do. He was ruling the land of Egypt. And in Genesis chapter 42 is where his brothers came down into Egypt to buy food, because the famine had hit the land of Canaan and they didn't have any food, and they had heard that there was food in Egypt, so they went down. And when they got there, Joseph recognized his brothers, but they didn't recognize him. You got to remember, he was 17 years old when he was sold into slavery, and this was 22 years later. So Joseph at this time would have been, what does that make it, 39 years old? And Joseph had changed a lot from 17 to 39, but his brothers were much older than him, and I'm sure that they looked very similar to the way that they did, when he was 17 years old. So he was able to recognize them, but they didn't recognize him. And Joseph started doing some things with his brothers here that I've heard people interpret this, that this was bitterness on his part, and that he was trying to punish his brothers and he wanted them to suffer like he had suffered. And I'm telling you, that is absolutely not the case. And I think many people will say, well, why not? Because that's what they would have done. And so they just suppose that this is what Joseph was like. But I'm telling you, you don't have the things in Joseph's life. You don't see this character, this maturity, this quality, this excellence in a person who's full of revenge and hate and stuff like that. That's totally inconsistent. I believe that there's another explanation of why he did this. And as I go through this, I'll make these points more clear, but let me just say this up front, that his brethren were wicked, evil men. Some of you may not realize that, but Reuben, the very firstborn of Jacob, is a man who committed incest with his stepmother. Simeon and Levi were two men that got mad at these people in the town of Shechem because the son of the king of Shechem had had sexual relationship with their daughter Diana. So they lied. They got these men to put themselves in a position that made them vulnerable, and Levi and Simeon went in and killed hundreds of people, wiped out an entire city in vengeance, and took the women and the children and all the cattle and everything as spoil. I mean, it was brutal. It was vicious. There's no way to whitewash this. And that was not God's will. That was just evil, evil man. Judah, the next born of Jacob, is a man who committed incest with his own daughter-in-law. And you can just go down the line. And even the ones that didn't do something that was, considered worthy of prison or something like that, they all consented to selling Joseph into slavery and selling him as a slave. They were wicked, evil men. And instead of Joseph doing these things to his brothers that he did because it was vengeance and bitterness and he was wanting them to suffer, I believe that Joseph realized that God was going to use him and his position to bring these evil, wicked men to the end of themselves and to see them finally broken to the point that they would humble themselves and turn to the Lord. I'm telling you, if this evilness hadn't been stopped in these brothers, it would have just been reproduced on through their generations, and the children of Israel would have been more wicked than the people in the land of Canaan that God drove out. I don't believe that Joseph's actions here were punitive at all, but they were corrective. He was using the position that God had given him with the knowledge that someday his brethren were going to get rid of this hatred, this bitterness, this pride and arrogance, and that they were going to be brought to the end of themselves and humble themselves and be repentant and turn to God. So here in the 42nd chapter is where all of Joseph's brothers, all except the youngest one named Benjamin, 10 of his brothers came down into the land of Egypt to buy food. And Joseph recognized them, but they didn't recognize him. Here in verse 23 it says, "And they knew not that Joseph understood them, for he spake unto them with an interpreter." So what this is talking about is when they first came down, Joseph looked at them and started asking them some questions and said, "Who are you? Where did you come from? How many brothers do you have? Do you have a father?" He was asking these questions, and so they didn't understand that they were in trouble. They were just answering the questions. They said, "Yes, we have a father. He's an old man in the land of Canaan." Said, there were 12 sons. One of them is not, talking about Joseph. They were counting him as if he was dead. And the youngest is still with his father at home. And he said, "No, you're spies. You've come here to spy on us so that you can attack us." And boy, they were just taken back. "No, we're honest men." And so he said, "Nope, you're spies." And he says, "This is how I'll know that you're not spies." He says, "You'll have to all be kept in prison, and you choose one person to go back, and you bring that young brother that you talked about to me. And if you can't produce him, then I'll know that you were just lying to me, and I'm going to take you as spies." And he could have killed them. So for 3 days, he put all 10 of these brothers in prison. And at the end of 3 days, he came back to them and he says, "Look, I fear God." And as it says right here, this verse we read, that he was speaking through an interpreter. So they didn't know that he could understand them. And he says, "I fear God. You leave one of your brothers here." And it turned out it was Simeon. They left Simeon in prison, and the other 9 went back. And the only way they could ever reclaim Simeon and come back and get more food was if they brought this younger brother, Benjamin, back. And when he put these conditions on them, they were just shocked. And they were speaking among themselves, and they said, "You know what? All of this is happening because we saw our brother cry to us and beg for mercy." This is referring all the way back to Genesis chapter 37, when they took Joseph, stripped him of his coat, and threw him in this pit. In Genesis 37, it doesn't say that Joseph said a word, but here they're referring back to it. And they said one to another, "We are verily guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us and would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us." And Reuben said unto them, saying, "Spake I not unto you, saying, Do not sin against the child, and you would not hear? Therefore, behold, also his blood is required at our hand." And the next verse says they didn't know that Joseph could understand them. But Joseph began to hear them finally relate the bind that they were in at that moment all the way back 22 years before when they had sold him into slavery. It touched his heart, probably it touched his heart to hear that Reuben had planned to come back and save him, because he never knew this detail until right here 22 years later. And it said that it moved Joseph so much that he went into another room and wept, and he had to compose himself and come back. Again, this is not the reaction of a bitter person who's doing these things punitive just to punish and hurt his brothers because they had hurt him. This is someone who loved these brothers, and he realized God had put him into this position, and God was going to use him to break these wicked people and finally have them realize that you can't live the way that they were living and prosper. They needed to recognize that there were consequences to their ungodly living. And Joseph was just using his position to bring these brothers to the end of themselves. So finally, he only kept Simeon, and he released the brothers, and they went back home. And they told their father Jacob about all that had happened, and Jacob got mad at them, like, why did you tell him that you had a younger brother? And they said, well, we didn't know what he was going to do. We were innocent in all of this. And so Jacob said, no, I'm not going to let Benjamin go down. Says, I've already lost Joseph. Now I've lost Simeon. Basically, Jacob was willing to let Simeon rot in jail rather than run the risk of sending all of them back with Benjamin and losing Benjamin too. For those of you that aren't familiar with this story, Benjamin and Joseph were the only two sons of Rachel. And Rachel is the one that Jacob really loved. Leah and the concubines were not they weren't his favorite wives. He loves Rachel, but he only had two children by Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. Jacob believed that Joseph was already dead, and he just could not stand the thought of losing Benjamin. He had already had Rachel die, and so this was the only, the only child left to him of his favorite wife, and he just wasn't willing to do it. So he refused to let them take Benjamin back. In chapter 43, it goes and talks about that the famine was so severe that they had run out of the first food that they had bought, and so the brothers came to their father and they said, we've got to go back and get more food. We're going to starve if we don't have it. And he says, no, you can't go back. And he says, we've got to go back. And says, well, then you're going to go back without Benjamin. And the brothers said, no, we won't go without Benjamin. The ruler of the land told us plainly if we came back without Benjamin, yeah, we could all die. We could be taken as spies. And so finally, out of necessity, Jacob gave in and he said, all right, I'm going to let you take Benjamin with you, but he says, take all of these gifts, all of these presents. They took dates and figs, and they took all of these things as an offering, and they took it back. Also, the very first time when they had gone down to buy the grain, and as they came home, they found that all of their money that they had paid for this grain with was back in their sack's mouth. And that had caused fear in them, like, what's happening? So Jacob told them to go back, take new money, plus take the original money and just tell the man that, they don't know how it happened, but here's the original money that we should have paid. Here is our second payment for more grain, and go back and just ask for mercy. And finally, Jacob said, if I be bereaved of my children, I'm bereaved. In other words, there was no alternative. And so they went down the second time. And when they came the second time, and when Joseph saw Benjamin, his youngest brother, which at that time, Joseph was 17 when he was sold into slavery. We don't know exactly how old he was when his younger brother Benjamin was born, but I suspect that Benjamin could have been, less than 10 years old when Joseph was sold into slavery. And so I'm sure that 22 years later, he was a totally different person. He was a grown man, and it just moved Joseph to be able to see his younger brother, the only brother that didn't participate in selling him into slavery. And Joseph was touched by it. So Joseph had all of his brothers come home to his house, and he threw a feast. And so they came in. They went to the steward of Joseph's house, and they told him, says, look, here's our money that we brought the first time, and when we got home, we found that this money was back in our sack's mouth. We don't know what happened, but they were totally upfront, and they told him, says, here's this original money, and we want to pay it back. And this steward said, don't worry, says, your God has blessed you. I'm the one that put the money back in the sack's mouth. Man, there is no telling how this affected them. Why would anybody do that? What was going on? And here they were brought into Joseph's house to eat with him. Who were they? I mean, I'm sure that fear, questions were just dominating these people. They didn't know what was going on. At noontime, Joseph came in and he talked with them briefly through an interpreter, and he sat all of the brothers from the oldest unto the youngest. Now this is significant. It makes mention of this. Genesis chapter 43, verse 33, it says, they sat before him, the firstborn according to their birthright, and the youngest according to his youth, and the men marveled one at another. You know, it'd be easy to pass over this, but here's the significance of this. How did anybody there know who was the oldest and who was the youngest? And yet they were seated exactly according to their birth order. How could anybody know that? How could this happen by coincidence? There was 11 of them. How could this just happen? They marveled at it because they knew something is happening. How did anybody know that Reuben was the oldest, and then Simeon, and then Levi, and then Judah, all the way down to Benjamin? How did they know this? Plus, when they brought the food to the people, it says in verse 34, and he took and sent messes, or in other words, portions unto them from before him. But Benjamin's mess or portion was 5 times so much as any of theirs. Man, this was amazing. Not only did somehow they know the order of all of the birth of these, but Benjamin, the youngest one, was given 5 times as much food, which I believe was reflective of the fact that this was the actual physical, full brother of Joseph, the only brother who didn't participate in selling him into slavery, and it just revealed Joseph's love toward him. But boy, just get the picture of this. It was amazing. And here they were eating and drinking in the home of the most powerful man over all Egypt, who they had been fearful of, and yet somehow or another he had returned their money into their sacks. He knew their birth order. He was favoring this youngest son. What was going on? And so after they had eaten and everything, Joseph dismissed them and let them go. But he told his steward to put his special cup in the sack of the youngest one and then send them out. So they left and they were headed home. And after they'd just gotten a short ways out of the city, Joseph sent his steward and he says, you go tell them that one of you have stolen my master's cup. And so when he confronted them with this is in Genesis chapter 44, they said, no way, none of us would have done that. It says, if you find that cup among any of our stuff, let the person that cup was found in his sack, let him be, a slave to Joseph forever. And so the servant said, okay, according to your word. And he started at the oldest. Again, this is one of those things. How did they know who was the oldest? But they started at Reuben and they went down through every single sack. And when they finally got to Benjamin's sack, there was the cup, and the people, these brothers were just shocked because Benjamin was the one person that they could not leave. They had to bring him back. Judah and Reuben had actually promised their father that if they didn't bring Benjamin back to him, that he could kill their sons. They were willing to substitute and sacrifice their sons for Benjamin. So Benjamin, it was just absolutely non-negotiable. Benjamin had to go back with them. But this steward arrested all of them, brought them back to Joseph, and Joseph, appeared to be angry and says, don't you understand that a man such as I can tell that you have taken something from me? And he says, now on this younger brother, he's going to be my servant. He'll be my slave. The rest of you, I'm letting go, but he has to remain here. And they just could not do that. And so they begin to humble themselves. And I'm running out of time today. Let me just say a couple of things quickly, and then on our programs next week, I'm going to get into this and amplify it more. But finally, they began to humble themselves, and they said, we can't go back without this younger brother. And they began to explain the whole thing, explain how they had even promised to give their children to their father as a substitute for Benjamin if he didn't come back, and they couldn't do it. And then finally Judah, the guy who had committed incest with his own daughter-in-law, a guy who had some serious problems, but he finally just came clean, and he spilled the whole thing to Joseph. And he began to start telling him, he says, that we deserve this. We are reaping what we've sown. And he began to humble himself, and he just became a totally broken man. Prior to this time, if you'll remember, I was sharing that Reuben had committed incest with his stepmother. Simeon and Levi had murdered possibly hundreds of people and just brutally killed all of these people. Judah had committed incest with his daughter-in-law. They were wicked people, and they were lying to their dad and persisting in this and just living a completely ungodly lifestyle. Finally, Judah humbles himself and begins to confess to Joseph that, you know what, this is justice. We deserve this. We took our younger brother and sold him into slavery, and he just begins to spill his guts and confess everything. He had come to the end of himself, which is, I believe, what God ordained all along. These visions that he gave Joseph when he was just 17 showed his brothers coming and bowing down to him. And it wasn't just the physical action, although it included that. It was the fact that they humbled themselves. They finally yielded. Their ungodliness yielded to the righteousness of Joseph. And I believe that this is what Joseph's intent was all along. He was never out to punish these guys. He wasn't trying to wreak vengeance on them. If he was, he wouldn't have done the things that he did later. If he was full of hatred and vengeance, he would have taken it out on Potiphar and Potiphar's wife for what they did to him. This is just completely inconsistent with everything that we read about Joseph. Joseph was doing this for the benefit of his brothers, trying to bring them to the end of themselves, that they would quit living this ungodly life, thinking that they can do these things and get by with it. He finally held them accountable. He finally showed them that there were consequences to their actions, and they finally got the message.
I was arrested for first-degree murder, 2 attempted first-degree murders in 1993. They ran my time concurrent, which means put the time together. So I did 7 years and 3 months in prison. While I was in prison, I had a brother in the Lord introduce me to Andrew Wommack, to one of his cassette tapes. So I got excited about that and started studying, and it brought a lot of balance to the things I heard. And I was just so excited that I could get these tapes for free. This is my treasure from other partners, from when I first got introduced to Andrew Wommack, and then all the video, the months I was getting once I got out of prison. I just continued to get them, and this time I wasn't getting them for free. I was paying for them because I had a job. I was out of prison, thank God. As soon as I got out, I started doing prison ministry, going back into the prisons. I just want to thank really everyone that gave to the ministry, all the partners, which now I am a partner, to get the teachings to me to bring balance in my life. I started my own business. I went from 5 people to 60 people. I realized I can't run a business by myself. I need people I could count on. Same thing with the ministry. Andrew Wommack doesn't do it by himself. He needs the people that are involved, the partners that are involved, to be able to do what he does at such large scale.
Partners, I want to say thank you for helping me to reach out and touch Gerardo. He could not have gotten these tapes if it hadn't been for our partners. If you aren't a partner, I'd like to encourage you to become one today.